that's my center at Bristol. Now, that's the title of the paper I started off with. I can't promise to deliver that in its entirety, but at least you get the intention. So on the slide are very well-known theorists. I'm sure you'll recognize the name straight away, and countries which have been developing policies of multiculturalism. So here's multiculturalism in theory and practice. And the first point I want to make really is not a question in relation to is multiculturalism compatible with nationalism. It's not really a question of if. If we look at this list, we see it's a question rather of how. Because it is a feature of political multiculturalism to date that it is understood as being contained within a national consciousness and framework, while simultaneously and essentially rethinking and remaking that consciousness and framework. And I certainly include myself in that general statement, and I hope you can see that's true of both the best known political theorists on the subject, as well as the countries who we tend to think of as developing elements of multiculturalism. In order to not get stuck on what is nationalism, because obviously that's enough to fill a whole library by itself, I'm just going to work with a very broad definition or understanding of nationalism as on this slide. And you see I've divided it into two. So the minimal, i.e. what you might say the threshold, when we can begin to talk about nationalism, but it doesn't mean that that's the end of the matter either. So there is a second part of the definition. So beginning with the first part, the minimal part, I say that it's a societal perspective or a politics that gives normative significance to the national. So it's clearly not just a descriptive or analytical concept, it's a normative concept. Having said that, then as I say, you could say a lot more about nationalism, which I won't really be doing so. I just say, and then when it connects to other things that have normative or that have normative significance, especially state, citizenship, and belonging. And very crudely, you could say the more things it connects to that are normatively valued, the more nationalist a ism we begin to get, because we get this interaction of a cluster of normative concerns reinforcing each other and developing in particular directions. So one implication of this is that nationalism can be of different kinds, many different kinds. It can have, as it were, it can be more or less, minimal or maximal. And that's really just like other isms, like socialism or capitalism or feminism. You can have more or less. It doesn't always come, as it were, of the same kind or in the same quantity. Moreover, and this is really quite an important implication, is not all varieties of nationalism are compatible with or friendly with each other. So to talk about something called multicultural nationalism doesn't mean it's compatible with all forms of nationalism. Actually, just the opposite. It is in opposition to many forms of nationalism. It's in opposition to most of the positions in theory and in the world today and in the past that we think of as like strong nationalism, namely monocultural, exclusionary nationalism. So the relationship between multiculturalism and nationalism is based on the proposition that cultural neutrality of the nation, of the national state, is impossible. Again, I'm sure it's an idea everybody's familiar with. Let me illustrate it like this. How does a country, how does a polity decide what should be a national language? Of course, most of the time, most countries don't decide this matter, but occasionally they do. But let's say, in theory, how do they decide this? And let's illustrate it. Suppose some people in Germany argue that not German, but Turkish should be the national language of Germany. And this is just an illustration. We could just turn it the other way around as well. Suppose some people in Turkey argue that German should be the national language of Germany. Now, for many people in political theory and indeed, various forms of political commitment, the only way of considering this question would be as a practical question. Will it work? Is this a feasible idea? What are the benefits? And what are the costs? In particular, of course, it would be very, very expensive to make Germany a Turkish-speaking country, as the national language. Imagine all the education that has to be done, let alone, all the translations and everything. But nevertheless, someone could say, well, let's make it a 25-year project to do this. For a lot of people, political theorists, if they were true to their theoretical commitments, they would be culturally indifferent to the question. They just say, yeah, it doesn't make sense, or they may say it makes a lot of sense. Commercially, for instance, we could do more trade with Turkey. They may say, or Turks may say we could do more trade with Germany or whatever. But there would all be practical questions with, if you like, money implications. That would be the issue. Because that's what cultural neutrality of the state means. But turning to the second, or what now is the third point on the bullet point, that means that neutrality means defining challenges to the cultural status quo, because German in Germany is the cultural status quo linguistically, that challenges to the status quo are illegitimate, except for those that call for neutrality. So if you call for neutrality, yes, that's a legitimate consideration, but any other considerations apart from the practical ones are regarded as illegitimate. So in a way, this is an indirect reinforcement of the cultural status quo. On the other hand, for non-neutralists, and that includes obviously multiculturalists, questions of identity are legitimate at a national, or what I sometimes call a macro level, and therefore are relevant to integration and multiculturalism. And what I mean by at a national or a macro level is, very briefly, that every country has some sense. Not everyone has an identical sense, but there's enough common ground. Every country has some sense of itself as the thing that it is, the society that it is, the country that it is, sense of its history, good or bad, prideful or shameful, its contemporary ethnic mix, its historical ethnic mix, its religion or religions, and so on. Those are the issues of identity, or if you like, culture, that are part of what that country is. And that's why they're relevant to multiculturalism. And in relation to this, then, I want to discuss two nationalist positions relevant to multiculturalism: liberal nationalism and what I'll call multicultural nationalism. So here are some comparisons and contrasts of what I mean by these two things, liberal nationalism and multicultural nationalism. So the first bullet point refers to, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about national identities, nations, states, countries? These are all overlapping terms and vocabularies. What are we talking about when we refer to the national or nationalism? Now, what's interesting is that there is, if we look at some of the authors, there is some disagreement amongst liberal nationalists, that's what LNs are, amongst themselves and between them and multicultural nationalists. So I give a couple of examples further down the slide. So Will Kimlicka, who, you know, it's great honor that he's part of this workshop. So Will thinks of nations as, you know, like Canadian First Nations, the Quebecois. Bhikkhu Parekh, you know, the leading political theorist of multiculturalism in Britain, he thinks of the national as polities. Though I think it'd be fair to say he doesn't have a single view across all his numerous publications, but that's probably the most recurring or settled view that he has. David Miller, you know, one of the leading liberal nationalists in political theory, he, and it so happens I self-categorize myself as a multicultural nationalist, not a liberal nationalist. When we talk about the national or nationalism, we mean independent countries, countries like Britain or Canada, which of course are polities, but are not reducible to polities. And so, of course, this shapes the nature of the theories offered. You know, it depends what you're talking about, will make a difference to what your theory is. And so in relation to now other contrasts between liberal nationalism and multicultural nationalism, in my paper, I do say a little bit about David Miller, but I'm going to leave that out here. There isn't time. But the main focus in the paper, and therefore in the rest of my talk, is on Will Kimlicka's understanding, as I see it, of his liberal nationalism and its relationship to multiculturalism. And so that's what I'll now turn to. So in Will's most famous foundational book of 1995, Multicultural Citizenship, he obviously offers a theory of multiculturalism. And I'm going to offer a very, very simplistic, but I hope not totally inaccurate rendering of that theory in basically two premises and a conclusion. And obviously Will is with us today and he could tell me if I got this wrong. So premise number one is that individual autonomy is the highest good. Second premise is that Will has a concept of societal cultures, which he says are contexts of choice for individuals to become autonomous agents. So this is just a fact about how the world is. Individuals require societal cultures. So if you care about individual autonomy, you should care about, as it were, the presence and the character of societal cultures. And the conclusion he draws from those two premises are that liberal states, that is to say, autonomy respecting states, have certain duties to protect vulnerable minority societal cultures from domination. So very, very crudely, I say that's his theory. My main question about it isn't, does it work? It's, but what about minorities who do not have distinct societal cultures? And there's a hell of a lot of us. That is to say, post-immigration ethnic formations in countries like Canada and Britain and, you know, France and Australia, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we clearly, if we are, you know, what's sometimes referred to as migrants and second generations and third generations on, we clearly don't have a distinct societal culture from the rest of Canada or the rest of Britain, i.e. the rest of our country. I think everybody knows that Will champions such migrant groups, such, you know, minority groups. But my question is really not about Will's political position, but his theory, especially bearing in mind that what we call multiculturalism in Europe is about post-immigration ethnic formations. In fact, actually, that's what it's about just about everywhere, really, even including Canada, but not always in academic papers, but nearly always in political discourse. So my question really is then, how does the theory get to its conclusion, i.e. number 3, if the second premise is absent? Because obviously it needs that second premise to get to the conclusion. So my simple answer is it can't. That Will logically can't get to championing post-immigration groups theoretically. That his politics is left theoretically exposed. I'm just going to read out something from the paper now, which is summarized in the first 2 bullet points, but just to read it out. At a conference in November 2021 in Paris, held to mark the 25th anniversary of Will's multicultural citizenship, albeit delayed by a year due to COVID epidemic, Will gave a more heightened attention to national identity. Here meaning what David Miller and I mean by national identity rather than national minorities. Will argued that national states have a tendency, unless actively challenged, to create an exclusionary peoplehood, a we, based on the cultural majority. 2 things were needed to remedy this. Firstly, minorities should be provided with a protective shield of compensatory rights in the way elaborated in his famous 1995 book. However, it had become a growing conviction of his that this was not enough. Drawing on survey data created with colleagues, he suggested that even when members of minorities, especially post-immigration minorities, had full equal rights and were perceived as law-abiding, hard-working contributors to the economy and society and actively recruited by employers, they may still not be fully accepted and thought of as part of the national view. And and that survey data we're going to hear quite a lot more about in Will's paper and in Keith and Alison's paper this afternoon. So they may be thought to not fully be committed to, say, Canada and its national culture, or willing to make sacrifices for the well-being of the country, and worse still, to be thought of as disloyal. Under such circumstances, full equal citizenship or membership was not possible without a rethinking or remaking of national membership and the national identity. Will insisted, however, that this was a secondary task and that compensatory rights were fundamental. And this is what I want to challenge. I fully share the secondary argument about intellectually and politically rethinking national identity and membership. But I do not see how it is derived from Will's 1995 theory, his main theory. What, after all, we might call the political theory of liberal multiculturalism. Stronger still, I think that what Will thinks of as secondary is actually fundamental, because it is possible to derive from the idea of a national we that certain groups who are part of the we have special needs. These can be of welfare and economic needs, but also can be, say, cultural or religious needs that require to be accommodated. Compensatory rights may be regarded as a means of delivering recognition in certain circumstances. It is because dual recognition of a group as a group and as part of the we, the national we, is fundamental that we can have a political project of identifying and challenging misrecognition and working for the transformation of negative identities into positive identities without any theory of individualism, without any special theory. In short, while there is no logic that gets us from special rights to national multicultural inclusivity, once we have an idea of multicultural national inclusivity, that our co-citizens stand in need of recognition and their identities should be respected and should be seen as part of our national, multifaceted, plural we can argue for appropriate forms of accommodation, rights, if you will. While my concern is with the distinctive needs of post-migration groups, I think the same argument may have some purchase in relation to national minorities too. Or to put it another way, I find myself very much in political agreement with Will that minorities will never be fully accepted by majorities till both can play some part together in reimagining a shared national identity. But it is precisely because of agreement on that point that it suggests to me that Will's theory is not necessary in order to establish what he wants to say about ethnic minorities, as I can reach the same conclusions without the theory. As Jeff Levy has said of an approach such as mine, grouped together with colleagues into what he calls the Bristol School of Multiculturalism, and that he says does this, I quote from Jeff Levy, he says, it argues for a more open, less liberal-centric or constrained dialogue between cultural minorities and the dominant majority. It focuses on remaking the national narrative through inclusive public rhetoric, symbolic recognition, and institutional accommodation that is grounded in national inclusion itself, rather than in notions of individual autonomy and an expanded set of rights. The logic, Jeff goes on to say, the logic, as I read it, is that by broadening the national story, residual areas of institutional and social marginalization will lose their sanction and so reform. End of quote. And I want to say that Jeff has got me and the Bristol School of Multiculturalism right in that quote. Some other quick contrasts between what I'm calling multicultural nationalism and Will's liberal nationalism are the two bullet points in the second half of that slide. So Will says, you know, liberal nationalism probably means thinning the national culture, to which I reply, yes, sometimes, but don't turn a means to an end into a principle. You don't have to thin the national culture in all respects, and in some respects, you'll have to do just the opposite. In order to include minorities, you have to include their cultural identities. Recognition involves that. That means thickening the shared public culture, not thinning it. Moreover, I think that the inclusion of ethno-religious groups, especially now Muslims in Western Europe, and I dare say in Canada, involves the rethinking of liberal secularism. Here are two more differences with liberal liberal nationalism. If we could just quickly go through the next two slides. I won't go through them in detail, just flash them up. So I give one example of how the Church of England, if it's given a multiculturalist role, or if it, you know, accepts that role for itself, this could be an example of thickening the public culture. And then if we go to the next slide, I give an example of how religion in schools, as it becomes multi-faith education, but not just education, multi-faith worship, multi-faith instruction, as we have in British schools, that too is part of thickening the national culture. So both these two examples I give, which I've given in various writings, are thickening, not thinning, the national culture. And so, you know, they're doing it for multiculturalist ends. The thickening of the national culture is for multiculturalists' end. And very quickly to the next slide, please. I'm now reaching an end point, a conclusion. Majoritarian nationalism, you know, in so many countries across the world. Here are three alternatives that you'll all be familiar with, and I've been discussing at least one of them, or two of them. because you can go for a cultural neutral civic integrationist individualism as a response to this populist nationalism, or you can go for liberal nationalism with its emphasis on individualism and majoritarianism, or, which I haven't discussed here, you can go for a cosmopolitanism with its disavowal of national belonging altogether and the championing of open borders. But what I am commending to you is on my very last slide, which is this. This is my alternative to bad nationalism. Multicultural nationalism unites the concerns of some of those currently sympathetic to majoritarian nationalism and those who are pro-diversity. It therefore represents the political idea and tendency most likely to offer a feasible alternative rallying point to monocultural nationalism. Thank you.